Hi everyone, this is Grandmaster Eugene Perlstein, together with Chess.com, and I'm doing part 2 of my series, King's Indian Knight A6 variation. So Knight A6 is a weapon against the classical system for white, which goes after d4, Knight f6, c4, g6, Knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, Knight f3, castles, bishop e2, Knight a6. By the way, Knight a6 is what I prefer rather than the more standard e5 because it avoids this d takes e endgame after queen takes d8, rook takes d8, as I mentioned in part 1 of the series. And again, Knight a6 also allows e5 and c5, so two options to attack white's center. So castles, e5 is what I focus on, c5 is more Benoni type positions after d5. And here in the first lecture I covered d5, which after knight c5 gives a great game to black. Another move, rook e1, where I show you my pet line, bishop g4, and black is again fighting for the key central squares. And here we're going to talk about the main line after the move bishop e3. So with the move bishop e3, white basically tells black, look, I don't mind you taking on d4, doing any of your other stuff, because for now at least the knight doesn't really belong in the center. The knight is on a6. And really, black needs to do something to make white play d takes e or d5. So the way to challenge white in the center is to play knight g4. And here white uses that tempo to hit the queen with bishop g5. So far so good, this is all theory. And here black has two main moves. One is simply to kick the bishop out with f6 and then follow up with the knight a6, maybe knight f7 plan, and try to maneuver around in the center. But this is a bit slow. And the move that I like is queen to e8. Queen e8 is one of those subtle moves where it serves several functions. Number one is potentially queen is going to be x-raying the e4 pawn maybe under attack, or queen will be able to recapture the pawn on e5. And the main idea behind knight a6 is that you're not afraid of the moves knight d5 or knight b5 because your pawn on c7 is defended. So here after queen e8, white has two main moves. White can play rook e8, rook e1, sorry, create this very unpleasant x-ray for the queen. White can play d takes e, and this is what we're going to look at in this lecture. There is also move h3, which is not dangerous at all, and I'm going to mention it shortly. So let's look at the main line, d takes e, and now h3. So white is kicking the knight away. So here black has again two options. You can play h6, hitting the bishop, or f6, the move that I prefer. They're about equally popular, or it really depends on the matter of taste. But I really like the move f6 because my knight is going to come to h6 in the future and f7. And as David Bronstein said, the best position for a knight, for a King's Indian knight, is on f7. And you're going to see shortly why. So before we go even further, let us try to understand why white can simply take on g4, f takes g, and just simply take on g5. Isn't just white up a pawn? And my answer is yes, white is simply up a pawn. But the problem is, after queen e7, knight h3, very ugly square, but if you're up a pawn, you might as well try to keep on that pawn. Because knight f3, I simply pick up the g4 pawn. Okay, so knight h3, and now I simply play c6. And it turns out that even though black is down a pawn, strategically white is in serious trouble. The reason being is that the knight on h3 is sort of dead. It has no future. The pawn on g4 is only a nuisance. It can't really help white. Whereas black has a very straightforward shot. Knight c5, e6. The knight from e6 is going to control a lot of key squares, and in particular, the key square on d4. As I mentioned in lecture number 1, in a lot of positions in King's Indian knight a6, once the center station clears up, you're always going to have that d4 outpost, because the c2 pawn is no longer there, it's on c4, and black's pawn from c7 is always going to protect the d5 square with c6. So this is very important and gives black more than enough counterplay. So that's why strong grandmasters stop playing this and no longer go for this pawn win. And after f6, the most popular move is simply to retreat bishop to d2. Retreating to h4 doesn't make any sense. The bishop is going to be closed off behind these pawns, and there's really no point behind bishop h4. So after bishop d2, black plays knight h6, and we are in the main line of the bishop e3 variation of this setup. Again, queen on e8 feels comfortable. Knight on a6 temporarily defends the c7 pawn, so moves such as knight d5 will always be repelled by the move c6. So knight d5 is totally pointless. And now black has a very typical plan. Put the knight on f7, and in the right moment go for f5, sometimes even f4, and maybe even g5, h5, and g4. For all those King's Indian lovers, this plan is actually quite lethal in some positions and results in direct attack on the king. But let us not get carried away and make a strong move for white. Queen c1. This is hitting the knight on h6, so knight better retreat, and now creates a very masking resource, c5. Very interesting idea. It looks as though this is simply a pawn sack, if knight takes c5, but the masking idea behind queen c1 is this x-ray idea on the pawn on c7. And now after the move knight d5, we are hitting the pawn on c7 with a fork, and we are hitting the knight on c5. So really black has to retreat to e6 if he wants to stay in the game. And now white has two options. White can take on c7, follow up, basically this is follow up to his strategy. And the second option is to try to win the exchange, or force black to play knight d6 or c5, of course, which are quite inferior moves. So before we go and look at this exchange win, let's go and look at the simple knight takes c7. Knight takes, queen takes. So for a long time, it was considered that white should have a simple advantage in this position. The reason being is that black can develop the bishop from c8 because you're going to drop the pawn. So if bishop e6, for example, queen takes, rook b8 is not going to help much because a7 is weak. And again, you're simply down the pawn. Another point is that the rook on f8 is going to be trapped if white were to play bishop b4. At the same time, white wants to centralize his rooks and maybe even throw in bishop c4 in there. So it looks as though black is up against very bad odds, this immeasurable number of threats. But there is one move, and it's so rare, especially in modern chess theory, one move that saves the game, and it's it's by the move, by that piece, the knight on f7 that I told you about, which is a star piece. Knight d8, excellent. You're moving backwards, but at the same time, this knight creates very powerful defense. It defends the b7 pawn. It opens up the square for the rook. The bishop is going to go to e6 without any problems, and the knight is later going to come to c6. The whole position will unravel. All of black's pieces are going to get activated, and all of a sudden, it turns out that white has no opening advantage at all. For example, bishop c4 check, then bishop e6. And again, it's not so clear what to do. Rook is going to come to f7. Rook potentially can come to c8. Again, knight can come to c6. Not clear what to do at all. The bishop to b4. Again, we throw in rook f7 in there. Again, if queen were to retreat, there is another temper we can throw in with knight c6. Overall, the position has taken a turn for the better for black, and white has absolutely nothing at all. Black has a very easy game. So remember this move, the star move, knight d8, very important idea. Now another move is bishop b4. As I told you, moves such as c5 don't really do much because you really haven't solved the problem with the knight on d5 coming to c7 and all other problems. The key here is you got to understand that sometimes it's okay to give up an exchange, especially for very powerful dynamic play. So that's why c6 is a very strong move. And the first game where this happened was actually in my own game against Shaba, where I got a good position out of the open. So after bishop takes f8, queen takes f8, knight e3, I played the move knight d6. I was very proud of this move and in general of this game because unfortunately I actually didn't win this game, but I got a very good advantage. So after knight d6, queen c2, f5, all of a sudden black's pieces spring into life. You know, the pawns are fighting for the center. If e takes f, g takes f, now I got another threat, e4, knight's coming to d4. Again, very powerful position for black. Now, I should also mention that besides this move knight d6, black can also try to fight for the initiative with the move knight d4. Now, this is hitting the bishop, so white better take. Pawn takes, knight c4. Now again, very strong move, f5. Notice how you see the two bishops being activated. You got a powerful 4 pawns, d4, c6, b7, a7 against the 2 pawns, which is going to create a very powerful pawn launch in the future. You're going to launch your pawns, and then white is really going to be fighting to stop them. And it doesn't even feel like black is very down in exchange or material because the rooks are not playing. So overall, I just wanted you to understand the main concept of this exchange sack is that you get a lot of dynamic play for the pieces and for the exchange, and your pieces spring to life, especially your bishops. You get some key outposts in the center. All right, so let's rewind and look at some other options for white. Besides c5, white can slow play this position as well. White can play bishop e3, and the idea is simply to play for the queenside pawn storm with a3, b4, etc. Now, bishop e3, you can simply follow up with your plan of c6. For example, a3, queen e7. The idea may be knight c5. And if b4, then knight c7. c5. And here black has two options. You can play knight e6 followed by f5. And then all of a sudden black's pieces spring to life on the king side. And if white tries to play like knight d2 after f5, all of a sudden white is not in time because knight c4, f4, and now knight d4. All of a sudden it's black who is now dominating the game. White is really behind. Knight b3 is a big threat, and now you got all this very unpleasant pawn storms. And f3 is a big threat. Again, the position is just very bad for white. So let's go back. And this is what we looked at so far. So the key move to understand after queen c1, knight f7, bishop e3 is your plan of activating the knight from c6. From a6 you play c6, followed by queen e7, then if possible knight c5, if not, then knight e7, knight e6, and then f5. Another possibility is actually bishop e6. This is more for those who are positionally inclined, who don't like to leave, any of the pieces undeveloped. Although the knight on c7 does really belong on e6, so you kind of have a little bit of conflict of interest here. But nevertheless, the position is stable enough and good enough. You can continue with f5 in the future. And again, very, very good pieces for black. No weaknesses. And the knight on f7, again, controls the key squares. The square on d6, the pawn on e5 is defended. The square on g5, where it can participate in the attack. Very strong piece. But I would probably play knight e6 with immediately launching my attack as quickly as possible. All right, so let's go back. And look at some other options for white. One tricky move here is h3. Now, if black is not careful and black were to play knight f6, then white can do very interesting idea here. White can play either bishop takes f6 right away, followed by c5, or even c5 right away. But basically the idea here is, after such move as d takes c or e takes d, you throw in knight d5, hitting the bishop. And now if bishop retreats, you throw in bishop takes a6. And all of a sudden, the c7 is really weak, and the position becomes very critical for black. If black were to defend the c7 pawn with bishop d8, then after bishop takes, pawn takes, notice how this position is just slowly falling apart here. For example, pawn takes, and now if pawn takes, queen takes, it's just not very nice here to play. You got a lot of weaknesses, the bishops are backwards, and no counterplay at all. This knight is just way too strong. That's why after h3, you gotta be vigilant and play f6. If h takes g, f takes g, with exactly the same ideas as before. And if bishop retreats, bishop d2, or even bishop c1, you can simply drop back to h6 with knight f7 and same kind of play as before. So no problems there at all. Another move is, of course, h6, but this potentially can transpose to a different position if, let's say, bishop retreats. You can take on d4, knight takes, knight f6, or you can go knight f6 right away. Now, important here for those of you who play h6 after bishop h4 is not to retreat the knight to f6, because you get exactly the same problem with c5 stuff. That's why you got to be very careful and take on d4 first, creating a little threat on the knight on c3, and after knight takes, knight f6, and now black is fine. The position is a little bit different than when black plays f6, but nevertheless, I played against black as black against Nakamura and achieved a good game. And really, there's no problems. So let's go back. And so we talked about the move d takes e. We talked about the move h3. The key move left, and this is one of the main moves and which became really popular these days, is the move rook e1, which we're going to cover in part 3 of the series. And now I want to focus your attention of the most provocative move, or most challenging move to whole setup for black, the move c5. So same exact idea as after h3, knight f6, bishop takes f6, and then c5. Here it's actually even more. So white is saying, I'm not even going for any of these tricks, try to lure the knight to f6. I'm going to try to open up the position immediately and use the powerful pieces, the two centralized knight, the bishop on g5, to try to take advantage of black's structure. C5 is very, very dangerous if you're not prepared. As a matter of fact, I played it several times as white myself. But there was a critical game by none other than two very strong King's Indian players, Nakamura, Hikaru Nakamura is white, against Luke McShane in 2009, where McShane showed a very powerful idea against c5. So e takes d, knight d5. This is the whole idea. Remember, as I showed you before, when knight f6, bishop takes f6, bishop f6, even though there it works more in favor of white. Here it's simply white is actually second pawn. So now bishop e6. Well, Nakamura says I'm going to get a free exchange, but this is the key. Sometimes it's important to be able to sacrifice the exchange. Bishop takes d5, bishop takes f8, queen takes, e takes d, d takes c. And we got this position in the game. And it turns out that black has sufficient compensation. The reason being is, of course, he's got a lot of pawns. He's not afraid of bishop takes a6 doubling the pawns, because this pawn on d5 is weak, and it's really hard for white to get any counterplay going. So that's why Hikaru played queen b3, and now simply rook b8, and black is doing great. There are a couple more moves: rook f1, queen d6, just to illustrate the point, h3, knight d6, and in the game, Hikaru actually tried to play for a win and lost. And I recommend everyone to take a look at that game. And but clearly black has enough pawns for the exchange. d5 is now really weak, and Hikaru found nothing better than to take on a6, queen takes, rook c1, bishop f8. And black is just way too solid and actually had some good winning chances, and I ended up winning the game. Alright, so c5, let's go back again. c5 is a very important move to keep in mind when playing the system for black. The idea, of course, being to destroy the knight on a6, double up the pawns, and he's going to jump to d5. But in the meantime, after e takes d, bishop e6, bishop e7, black will get some pawns and have a great game, as Luke McShane just showed. So bishop takes d5. Actually, I'm sorry. Bishop takes f8, queen takes f8, e takes d, d takes c, and this is a great position. Alright, so now let me go back again to the bishop e3 line and summarize our key points here. Number one is, after knight g4, bishop g5, queen e8, white has several options. One move is h3, another move is d takes e, which is the main line. A very dangerous move, c5, that you have to be aware. And the last move that we haven't looked at and we're going to cover in part 3 of the series is the modern approach, the popular move rook e1. This has been played by some top players recently, and you have to really be well prepared to challenge this move. So thank you very much, and I hope you can enjoy this lecture and have some great games in the knight a6 variation. See you. Bye-bye.